I don't know how many of you believe in love at first sight. Obviously, my wife and my children qualify in that category for me. But about a month ago, I got an email from pretty much out of nowhere. I usually don't open these kind of emails because you never know if you're getting spammed or not. But it was an email from something called the Democracy Initiative. So I think you know from our television show, I can't ignore an email from the Democracy Initiative. And this particular email was entitled the Voting Rights Edition. And as you know, we talk about incumbency protection on the show, and one of the things we talk about is voting rights, that the people in office today skew the system to keep their jobs through voting rights, redistricting, campaign finance reform, ballot access, etc. So here's this marvelous piece of information I'm receiving from the Democracy Initiative. It's on voting rights, and I start reading through this paper. It's one of the best papers I've ever seen, produced by a gentleman named Sean Tremblay. And it's really a great educational piece. If you want to know anything about voting rights, you've got to see this piece. And in fact, we'll post it. We'll give you information today how you can find it, and then I'll get it posted on my third-party 101 website. Anyway, long story short, love at first sight. I reached out to Sean, and as a special treat, he's arranged for us today to interview Larry Cohen, who's the chairman of the Democracy Initiative. I know it's going to be a great interview, very informative, and a lot of fun. So Larry, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you.
Democracy Initiative, you know, you just, like I said, love at first sight, and what a great paper. So I figured we have to know who these people are, what they're doing, and how all my viewers can get involved. Tell us what is the impetus for the Democracy Initiative? What is it?
So the Democracy Initiative is a coalition of big membership groups, and what we like to say is, for all of us, regardless of where we come from, democracy issues, the issues you just rattled off, money in politics, voting rights, things like Senate rules, if they're not your number one issue, they need to be your number two issue, because your number one issue is not going to get reached with the state of the democracy in the U.S. So there's about 55 groups. It's most of the major environmental groups, most of the major labor groups, civil rights groups led by the NAACP, and then lots of community organizational networks, and student groups, and on and on. So 55 groups. The membership in those groups is over 30 million. And so obviously, if we can take this message about democracy deep enough, we can actually win rather than spend, you know, the next 50 years talking about it. And that's really our goal, is to set high goals on these issues and win. So we specifically started off about 3 years ago when we had a campaign that most of us were in called Fix the Senate Now. And Fix the Senate Now was about the misuse of cloture, or what people call filibuster. But when most people think of filibuster, they think of senators talking. And what's emerged in recent years, about the last 10 years, is filibuster without talking. We call it silent filibuster. And the last few Congresses have tied up every issue. They never were reaching the Senate floor, even nominations. And so without belaboring it, we can come back to it if useful. This coalition was able to get more than 3 million Americans involved to get the Senate rules changed so that nominations, the president's nominations, would be considered as the Constitution provides by advising consent of the Senate, not by advising consent of 60% of the Senate, with silent filibusters until that time, November of 2013, silent filibusters blocking literally hundreds of nominees, you know, every possible kind of nominee, even to positions that viewers would never have heard of. And so anyway, we brought that to a head in 2013, initially got the EPA commissioner, 5 members of the National Labor Relations Board, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's director, Cordray, and the labor secretary. Our first victory was getting that batch confirmed. And then 3 months later, we got the rules changed by the Democratic majority. The majority sets the rules so that a majority would confirm, in this case, over 100 federal judges that have been blocked. And we got that done before this last Congress ended at the end of 2014. So what we realized is, okay, great success, even though some would say modest, but, you know, given what was at stake, 500 nominations blocked up, great success. But what about the other, even more basic democracy issues? These multi-billion-dollar federal elections, voting rights at an all-time low, despite the passage 50 years ago of the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act itself gutted by Shelby County versus Holder, the Supreme Court decision that took the guts out of the Voting Rights Act. Yeah, voting rights are at an all-time low, even though we're celebrating the Voting Rights Act with films like Selma. In reality, we're right back there because we have a situation now where the turnout in the 2014 federal election was 40%. Voter registration in the U.S. is at 70%. To put that in context, almost no other democracy has registration. You show up and you vote. That's the world standard. We have this ridiculous process of registration that literally is knocking 25, 30 million voters off the rolls. And then we have other problems like immigration reform that the House has held up. And we have 20 million immigrants, long-term residents, who can't vote either. Either they have green cards or they don't have even a green card and they can't get from the green card to voting. So we have a huge crisis in voting rights in this country. It's of unimaginable proportion. And we have a similar huge crisis, and they're directly related, of money in politics. In 2016, we're looking at both likely presidential candidates for the two major parties spending in excess of $2 billion each in just 6 states because of yet another electoral issue we have, another democracy issue, the way the Electoral College functions. And so when you add this all up, this is not what democracy looks like.
Larry, great answer. But part of the problem with the answer is the problem is so pervasive that you had to list maybe 10 things that have to be fixed. You know what I mean? So,
yeah.
So before we get to the issues, I'd like to understand, how does the Democracy Initiative work in the census? How are you organized in terms of deciding, okay, we have 10 issues here. What are our priorities? And within our priorities, how are we going to solve that issue? So let's just pick on the Senate, for instance. Let's say that would be your top priority. How did this organization come together to decide that was a top priority? And then how did you make decisions about solving that problem?
Okay, so again, it's like that problem found us when President Obama's nominees, all of them, got jammed up, whether executive branch or judicial branch. They all got jammed up, literally more than 500 nominations. So you bring together the environmental community because the EPA commissioner, you bring together all of labor because the National Labor Relations Board, which is the only federal agency that looks at workers' rights, was about to literally be defunct. You bring in the financial reform community because they were attacking and preventing confirmation of Dick Cordray, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So that was about to fall apart. And so for those kinds of groups, we were all a little bit new to this democracy notion, but we knew that we had a burning issue about nominations. What we learned is that when we mobilized our members, and the watchword of Democracy Initiative is mobilizing millions. There's lots of smart technical groups on democracy issues, and many of them are also members or advisors to us, virtually all of them. But our piece of this is mobilizing millions. And that's what we did on the Senate rules. Over 3 million Americans, members of these groups, got involved. Now, again, that's probably 10% of the membership, but a good start.
So let me interrupt here quick. But the organization itself, do you have a board? How does this group make its own decision making and decide where it's going?
Yeah. So it's getting more and more formal, but we also want to stay flexible. So yes, it has a board. It's a 501c3 and a 501c4. That's the board that I chair. It has a staff. You gave a big high five to Sean, who heads up communications. Marissa Brown is the executive director. So it does have a small staff of its own. It also has staffing from not only the board members, but from the 55 endorsing groups. There's 55 groups that have endorsed the basic focus of the DI, which is money in politics, get the big money out. It's voting rights and Senate rules reform. But then there's a lot of other issues that sort of the coalition of the willing inside might take on in different locations. But the decision-making is done by the board. Once a year, there's a convening of all the endorsing groups, and we go over, what things look like for the following year. Every week, there's a conference call that Sean and Marissa lead, where the 55 groups jump on, what's happened this week. You know, the newsletter that you saw ties people together, but that's the basic framework.
Great. So, by the way, on our show, we've spent time on the Senate. We had a gentleman named Iris Shapiro wrote a terrific book called The Last Great Senate. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. And he educated all our viewers on these points. And one of the points is what you talked about. So I think you had an amazing victory there. One thing you didn't talk about, and I bumped up against this myself, as my viewers know I'm a lobbyist in my day job, is just the hold process, where one senator alone can put a hold on. So just anything you can do to free up process in the Senate is just terrific in my book.
Yeah, and I think one of our goals has to be sort of a populist organization. You know, we're not an arm of the Democratic Party. So how can we do a better job getting Americans across the board, independents, Republicans, to say, what does democracy look like? How do we all throw in on that, regardless of what we want to see come out of our democracy, that we have a common view of what our democracy should look like, you know, in the 21st century?
Now, as a lobbyist, I'm used to building coalitions, and you've built an amazing coalition here. But sometimes the problem with coalitions is that the unifying issue for the coalition is not the top priority for the individual members of the coalition.
Right.
So how do you hold this group together in that sense, that when you go to solve a problem, that they prioritize what you're doing high enough that it doesn't take away from their individual priorities?
Well, we try to link them. So let's take a newer example. Last week, we brought the leaders of most of those 55 groups to Roanoke, Virginia, joined by the affiliated organizations and others in Roanoke around voting rights, because the chairman of House Judiciary, Bob Goodlatte, that's his district. And we all showed up at Roanoke last Thursday in the middle of the hot day to say to Representative Goodlatte, we're here and we're going to have sustained action until you hold hearings on voting rights. And so the organizing objective for us running up to last week and now after last week is, how do we convince those 55 groups, and hopefully that'll keep growing as well, that voting rights is linked to their issue, whether their issue is workers' rights, climate change, civil rights issues, democracy issues themselves, just good old basic populism, that connection to Bob Goodlatte makes sense for them. When we get that connection made, and when they realize, hey, we're not doing this on our own, we have groups with 30 million members involved, then people begin to believe maybe we can help break up the logjam that House Judiciary, one member of the House, this is not democracy, one out of 435 people, the chairman of House Judiciary, supported by the Speaker, prevented any hearing on immigration reform, including the Senate bill, and has prevented any hearing whatsoever on voting rights, including a bill that was sponsored by a Republican member, Sensenbrenner from Wisconsin. So that's a second example of how we function. So about 150 key leaders of these groups got on a bus at Union Station in D.C. and spent 5 hours getting down there and 5 hours getting back. And we're in a 95-degree day, one by one coming up, and joined by about 20 Roanoke groups, because obviously the way democracy works is he's got to see that people in Roanoke care, not just that a bunch of national groups care. But as national groups were there to say to him, you wanted to be chairman of House Judiciary. You are the chairman. You're a national leader. You're not just there from Roanoke. Represent Roanoke any way you want. But you have 60, 70% of Americans clamoring for voting rights reform, and you won't give us a hearing.
So let's get to voting rights reform, and let's get to this election cycle we're in now. Is that now your top issue for the next 2 years? And if so, is your group focused on a specific solution or a specific set of solutions that you want to address?
So we see the two top issues as joined, which is money in politics in a federal election cycle that will probably hit $8 billion. It's an outrage, as I mentioned earlier, $4 billion likely on the presidential race alone in 6 states. The candidates the last time didn't campaign to any extent except fundraising outside of 6 states. So how are these two things linked, and what kind of an outcome do we get when we have voter registration under 70%? We have voter turnout for this next election, even with a president, likely around 50%. and we have a $7 billion federal election. That is catastrophic in terms of what our founding fathers, let alone those of us who believe they didn't go far enough, obviously, in terms of inclusion, had in mind. So we will link the two issues. We will work not just federally, which has got all kinds of blocks in it right now, but at the state level and at the local level, we'll work on public financing where we can, trying to replicate models like the New York City Council, where there's a 6-to-1 match at the local level. We will look at statewide voting rights opportunities like Oregon, that replicating Oregon, that just enacted basically anyone with a driver's license is in unless they opt out. There's a second check the box that you're a citizen. And then all kinds of other voting rights issues like the Moral Mondays movement in North Carolina, trying to hold the line and restore some of what's been taken away there over the last 3 years. So it's a wide program, municipal level, state level, federal level, but it's the two big issues are money in politics and voting rights.
So within those two issues, and again, that's why I said part of the problem is there's so many wonderful solutions. Do you, has your group now, this board, so to speak, come together and said, okay, for money, in this next cycle, we're going to hone down to this element of the money problem, and we're going to offer this solution, and for voting rights, we're going to hone down to this. For instance, I told you Heather McGee was on our show. We haven't run the interview yet. She loves the public financing, the 6-for-1, the New York model. Would that become perhaps your number one solution, or will you have a number one solution that you'll then push?
Yeah, so I would say we'll have more than one number one. Why is that? Because if we have one number one, we might not get anything. This group is big enough that we can go after 4 or 5 big things, and we're pretty much committed to those 55 groups that we're going to win on at least one of them. And so what does that mean? So most of us are part of Move to Amend to get a constitutional amendment around Citizens United and push that state by state and push that. We were very cheered by the vote of the Senate last year. But at the same time, yeah, we're going to go to Chicago, where we're already there, trying to pass something similar to New York around the Chicago municipal elections. Basically the same thing, 6-to-1 match. Last year we were active in New York State trying to get a very similar solution in the state, and came within a razor's margin of getting that done. We will stay on that as well. So lots of examples. Those are probably, I'd say Chicago is probably the biggest one, looking right now to replicate the public finance solution at the municipal level.
Yeah, I think if I was going to pick a number one campaign finance issue, I'd focus on Citizens United. We had Wolfpack on our show. They're working on passing state resolutions so we can have a constitutional amendment. Have you joined their effort? Have they joined your effort? Is there a commonality there?
We're not in that specific one, but we are involved with some of our key groups like Public Citizen and others, trying to push that state by state. But the reason that's not our only top priority is because the slowness of that process and the reality of what this Congress looks like and what it would mean to get a 2/3 vote. Yes, we could go around that if we had 3/4 of the state legislatures, but look at the state legislatures. So we need to give hope, particularly to younger folks, that there are solutions along the way, and that's why we point out the New York City Council, largest city in the country. Look at that city council. Look at the diversity. Look at the outcomes of having a city council like that. That cheers people that we can dig in for the longer run. So if we can bring that to places like Chicago or Waterloo or Albuquerque or Santa Fe or anywhere else, we're set up to bring that program, that model, a bunch of resources, and people ready to make that a reality. So we'll go in both directions.
And I'm a big fan of what you're doing is, pick the places you can win and then build a bigger coalition, and then use that coalition to put even more pressure on where you have to go. Love that theory.
That's it. You got it.
How about on voting rights? What are some of the top priorities for voting rights solutions?
So again, we are dug in on the kind of big one you're mentioning, which is getting hearings on voting rights. We don't have illusions about what this Congress will pass, but even the so-called Sensenbrenner bill would accomplish some things in some states. The coalition partners support the Leahy-John Lewis version, which is basically full restoration. But, this Congress isn't going to adopt that. And so we can go state by state. Voting rights is viewed as a state issue. And we intend to take on tough states. Again, we're part of the Moral Monday movement in North Carolina, but also states like Oregon, where we can adopt, automatic voter registration for anybody who has a driver's license. We want to try to build on that. States like Alaska. Alaska has pays people out of a state severance tax on energy, and every citizen in Alaska gets a check, and we want to automatically register them when they get the check. So we're going to be looking for novel ways to attack voter registration. We're tired of the treadmill where we spend, people have spent over the last 50 years literally billions of dollars on voter registration, and we're right back where we were.
So one of the things we were talking about before the show, and I told you I'm going to put you on the spot a bit here, when I look at the roster, and it's an amazing roster you have, it does jump out as something that leans Democratic. So, as you said, we have a Republican Congress, and as you know, we have more states right now where the governor and the legislature are all Republican than we've ever had before. So when you build your organization, do you see trying to build a more bipartisan organization so that when you show up, the receptivity is greater than if it's only seen as a Democratic organization?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. But you're right. Most of those groups would be sort of scored on the Democratic or left of center side. So I think that's a challenge. But we do work actively at times. With the Heritage Foundation, they have people there. Norm Ornstein on the Senate Rules. We work with on a community level where we take on these issues with all kinds of groups. Part of the thing is those national endorsing groups do tend to be, center left. But I definitely believe that we need to be in a populist frame where we appeal to people who are fed up with the lack of citizen control of the government, regardless of how they end up voting.
And again, let's go back and pick on Citizens United. I think in that issue alone, there's enough Republicans that are incensed by it that forming a larger coalition would be a great opportunity.
Yeah, the problem is you look at the Senate vote that we had, which we cheered as a victory, and I don't have that in front of me, but if we got any Republican votes on that, it would be one or two. I don't think we got any, but I might be wrong on that. But that's a big question to sort of libertarian types who are Republicans. How can you be a libertarian and believe that people can dump as much money as they want into the political system? That is not what democracy looks like. So yeah, we will continue to take up that issue in a bipartisan way.
Now, I read some of your materials, and I know this is a sensitive part of it. When you talk about corporations and Citizens United, part of the pushback is going to be, okay, but in particular, and by the way, and I'm from Illinois, there's a battle going on in Illinois that I don't have to tell you about right now. The union money side has to come to the equation too. So how do you guys handle that part of the conversation?
Yeah, well, and again, not every union agrees, so that shouldn't be a shock. But our frame of reference is get the big money out. But we're not going to get the union money out while the corporate money's in. But the kinds of reforms we would advocate would apply to everybody. And, unions are popular membership organizations. And unions, most of the political spend comes from voluntary contributions from members. My own opinion is somebody who until 2 weeks ago was the president of a large union, the Communication Workers Union, is, we're in. CWA was in on that. We were in on, with the democracy groups on Citizens United. We briefed on that side. Some weren't on that side at that time, and now they are. And some probably still disagree. But that's what democracy looks like.
And I think that's an amazing message. That's what I was asking you. I was hoping that was the answer. Because when people see that you're putting your skin in the game at the same time, and you're trying to break through this dysfunction and get to workable solutions, they hear that. I think it's a powerful message.
Yeah, and we're down on that. I personally am down on that. I mean, when I decided not to run again as president of CWA, doing this democracy work, as a volunteer, I was in CWA for a lot of years, so I have a decent pension. This was a key reason I didn't run again, because I came to believe that if the only thing I care about is workers' rights, we're never going to get there without a functioning democracy, and we don't have one. So I was really proud to have been a founder of Democracy Initiative. I'm proud to be the chair, and I'm throwing down here with these guys, with the staff here, and with the other volunteers for at least 10 hours a week. That may sound corny, but that's what I pledge to. As a volunteer, we're never going to get there, even if it's just workers' rights, let alone climate change, if we don't throw down on the democracy issue. And I'm proud that CWA is down on all fronts on the democracy issues, including getting the big money out of politics.
So you mentioned voting itself, and we spent a lot of time on this show. We had whole sessions on how deplorable the turnout was in the midterms, etc. Seems to me an important part of this is not only pushing your issue, but convincing people to vote, the people that do vote, to vote on this issue, and to get the people who don't vote energized around needing to vote on this issue. So how much time, if at all, will you spend on pushing people to vote on it and let their representatives know, this is what I'm voting on this year. I want my democracy to work. And again, if you can't solve immigration, if you can't solve all these other problems, I want you to solve our democracy first. How are you going to get people to vote on this issue? Where's that going?
Well, I think you have to connect. So again, the value we have is these 55 groups are specialists and have big memberships in certain key areas. We have to link at every minute, every soundbite, the democracy issues like voting rights, money in politics, to their issues, helping them do that. So go back to the CWA, communication workers, for a minute. So we had a booklet, I didn't bring it with me, that I helped write, 50,000 copies used with shop stewards and activists in the union that explicitly linked the democracy issues to workers' rights issues, and starts from the premise that if the only thing you care about is your collective bargaining agreement, that's directly linked, the impacts on it are directly linked to voting rights and to money in politics. And then we go through it. There's a 5-minute version and a 3-hour version of how that happens. But the CWA and other unions can do that version, and then environmental groups can do their version, and, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we do in the Democracy Initiative is share those materials and ideally help, whether it's the Sierra Club or anybody else, do that kind of training. Because quite frankly, if we're left with a democracy movement that only talks about democracy, it's never going to be big enough to accomplish it.
And it was interesting to me to see, and I got this, my first email I said on this piece from Sean, and it was identified with Sierra Club, and I thought, this is powerful to me, that a group that's uniquely identified with, let's say, environmental issues is putting this on the forefront. Very powerful.
Yeah, and let's give high fives to Sierra Club, Mike Brune, the director, but their whole board, because, they started out as a hiking club. And I'm a Sierra Club member for years. I'm also a hiker. They're known for their trips. And they have pushed themselves, this board of Sierra and their leadership, to linking climate change, first of all, to hiking. Even if the only thing you care about in the national parks, go to Glacier and see what you see. And then climate change, which they get into, and then the way Congress operates, including Senate rules, by the way. The House passed a climate change bill that never got on the floor of the Senate for 1 second, never discussed because of the silent filibuster, as you put it, unanimous consent, which was not in the Constitution. And so Sierra Club was with us on the Senate rules fight and quickly made the leap to money in politics and voting rights. But linked back to Sierra Club around climate change, and then who are the partners we need to win on this? How do we get to what we call 50 million Americans fighting for democracy? And, we have, if we had them all involved, 30 million now, but that's not 50. And so that gets the Sierra Club to say, well, wait a minute. Don't we agree that workers should have rights? Don't we agree that student debt is choking our kids? And on and on. And so they throw into the Democracy Initiative, not necessarily those other issues, believing that we need to get these big membership groups in, not just environmental groups. So that's sort of the journey that we each have gone through to get to this point.
Well, Larry, my viewers already know this was love at first sight for me. And now that they've seen you on the show today, I think they're going to be chomping at the bit to get involved in this because your enthusiasm is so infectious. How do my viewers get involved? How do they find the Democracy Initiative? How do they maybe drill down at the state level to get active?
Yeah, so the first thing, democracyforus.org. They go to that website. They can sign up for the newsletter that you enjoyed. We'll do more to show people on that website. If they're, well, most people are going to be a member or could easily be a member of one of the groups. I mean, they're not like high barriers to joining. So, they could join something like Sierra or the NAACP. That's really the best way to get involved, because then you're part of a group on the local level that's already into this. If not, they can sign up for the newsletter, and then we can sort it out from there. Democracyforus.org, that's the first place to go.
Thank you so much for this interview today, Larry. I know what a busy gentleman you are, but it's a great cause, and you are an amazing spokesperson for your cause. Thank you.
Okay, glad to be with you. Great programming, and glad to come back anytime.